commemorate certain specific anniversaries that have taken place throughout history that are important to U.S.-Greek relations, frankly. And this is one of those that is extremely important, in my opinion, and I'm sure, without getting into the details, our guest speaker today, Professor Harris Milonas, will delve into that, and I'm sure some of it will also come out during the Q&A. So it is, again, a pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here today. My name is Nick Larigakis, President of the American Hellenic Institute. For those of you who do not know me, let me, again, welcome you here to Hellenic House. Let me first thank the people who make a lot of this stuff happen here. It is our staff, and that's Emily Pandis and Elias Gerasulis, who are standing there in the back, so we certainly thank them very much. I would also like to recognize a couple individuals in the room. Lieutenant Colonel George Ioannou, Defense Attaché at the Embassy of Cyprus, and Colonel Vasilis Lambropoulos, who is the Defense Attaché at the Embassy of Greece. The other person hasn't shown up yet. When he comes, we'll recognize him. Anyway, on behalf of AHI, our nonprofit Independent Greek American Public Policy Center, it is my pleasure to present our noon forum in commemoration of the 79th anniversary of OXI Day, with special guest presenter, Professor Harris Milonas of the George Washington University. In 1940, with Europe under the heel of Nazi Germany, and with Britain fighting the Axis powers alone, Greece's reply on October 28, 1940, of OXI to Mussolini's surrender ultimatum gave hope to the forces of freedom. Greece, vastly outnumbered, ultimately defeated the Italian army and pushed them into the mountains of Albania. This defeat of Mussolini resulted in the first defeat of the Axis in World War II. Something, in my opinion, that is not well recognized enough in the Western world, and we need to change that. However, Greece eventually succumbed to the Nazi war machine, but not after a valiant effort that included a brave stand at the Battle of Crete, which caused Hitler to delay his invasion of Russia and change the outcome of the war. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure at this time to introduce our AHI board member, James Marketos, who's done a little bit of sidebars, if you will, regarding this whole genre of Greece's role in World War II, and who will present our distinguished guest speaker today.
Usually we commemorate occasions, but today we actually have the joy of not merely commemorating but celebrating. And I think it's worth taking a moment to think about how we as Greeks can be so proud that every so often Greeks do some things that really become pivotal moments, not just in Greek history but in world history. You can bring some of them to mind quite easily. 5th century BC, Marathon, Thermopylae. That's why none of us speak Persian today here. You go a little further, we have Alexander the Great, of course. One of my personal favorites is Constantine IV. You don't hear much about him. 7th century AD. He repulsed a 5-year siege of Constantinople, Arabs. And that is another reason. That's why we don't speak Arabic today. He delayed, in effect, the Arab conquest of much of the North African littoral and prevented the Arabs from making their way into Europe much earlier than when they tried to, than they eventually did. You've got the War of Independence, of course, which got the world's attention in the 19th century. And the last century, we can't forget the wonderful 2004 Olympics, which put Greece on the world stage and did a wonderful thing. So they're not all military things that we commemorate and celebrate, but they're things that we can take pride of. And even in this current time, we can take great pride in how Greece has held its head up through one of the worst recessions that any nation has ever suffered in recorded history, and has still come out and is on the way to something of a recovery. But today, to help us commemorate and celebrate the event that happened exactly 79 years ago this day, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Milonas. I won't read you his biography. It's printed in the notice that you've all received. But we should take pride in another fellow Greek, graduate of the University of Athens, University of Chicago, Yale. I won't hold it against you. One book awards for his books, is the editor of a peer-reviewed journal, and we are very pleased. Before he begins, I want to read just a passage or two quick passages from a book. This book was published in 1942 by a Greek, was originally published in Greece in Greek. It's now, my copy's in English. He's writing about 16 months rather, after the day we're celebrating today. And he's kind of reflecting on what it meant when it was still very fresh in people's minds. He says, not only did Greek resistance give rise to admiration, it also gave cause for hope. It breathed a new spirit into continental Europe and inspired free men in every land. For the first time, millions of men and women in Europe felt a new hope. For the first time since September 3rd, 1939, an Axis army had been defeated. And then he says, after reviewing the events of the last 16 months closely, but surprisingly interrelated, one is tempted to conclude that an incident of comparatively little moment which occurred in a small country, an emphatic no uttered in the small hours of the morning by an elderly, ill, and already doomed Greek statesman, was the beginning of a train of events of supreme importance with far-reaching consequences affecting the greatest powers in Europe. Please welcome Professor Milanas.
I'm going to try to celebrate this day with in a way, sharing with you my daily plebiscite of reaffirming my, I guess, Greek identity through this speech that I wrote for you, and for the day. So I'm going to build on some of the things you already heard, but I'm going to try to push it a little bit to the details also of what happened that day. According to most historians, World War II formally began on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland, although, of course, Japan and China had their own ongoing conflict earlier, but that's the formal date that we usually associate with World War II. At the same instance, France and the United Kingdom declared war against Germany, and ultimately two rival military alliances were formed by September 1940. The Tripartite Pact united Japan, Italy, and Germany as the Axis powers, and by the beginning of 1942, a little bit later, quite a bit later, the Allied Big Four by then included the United Kingdom, the United States of America, the Soviet Union, and China. Now, the patriotic duty of nations was clearly articulated at the time by each individual leader, but I wanted to share with you a quote by Winston Churchill today that put it quite well in the case of the United Kingdom. He said on May 28th, I think, of 1940, if this long island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. It's hard to imagine such a statement being made today, maybe, but it gives you a sense, I think, how the vividness of this quote gives you a sense of how people thought at the time. In terms of the role of small states, that I'm happy that you mentioned the disproportionate impact of Greece in a way in this war, and I agree with that. Smaller states, let's say, in the war, Professor Mavrodatos has recently argued one might speak of an existential bet, an existential wager. The belief that in the long run, nations believed at the time, a nation had a better chance of eventual rebirth or even survival if it went down fighting. And that was a really commonly felt belief and understanding that smaller states shared at the time. So the existential wager was not just made by the Greeks, although the Greeks were successful, was first made by the Finns, it was made by the Poles, then made by the Norwegians, not all of them, but some of them, but eventually by the Greeks, and in the event that we commemorate in a successful manner. So that also matters, of course, tremendously. Involving more than 30 countries, just try to think about 30 countries being involved in a war, and at a time when countries were much fewer than there are today, by the way, so there was a much bigger percentage of the countries of the world. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. I don't know if we can understand it just by numbers, but just contemplate that the estimates range from 70 to 85 million fatalities, most of whom were civilians. Beyond the myriad battle-related deaths, of course, that were involved, that happened during the wars, of course, millions of civilians died in massacres. They died in the Holocaust, in strategic bombing campaigns, as well as by the sole use of nuclear weapons in wartime. World War II ended by the summer of 1945 with the total victory of the Allies, and Greece was once again on the right side of history, as we like to repeat and say, having sided with the right allies. And that's something we need to recognize. And I'll come back to that when it comes to Metaxas's choice of October 28th, 1940. Now, it is often said that history is written by the victors, but when great powers are involved, we should tweak the saying a little bit. History is written by the victorious great powers. And in that sense, that could answer some of Nick Larengakis' question, why this is not more said or commemorated. Well, we didn't write the history, at least the global history.
We can amend it, though.
We could amend it. So I'm going to try to amend it here today with you. So, however, exactly as Nick suggested, despite being a small state, Greece managed to get included in the pages written by the victorious powers, great powers of World War II themselves, especially the United Kingdom and the US, the United States of America versions of it. In terms of military history, the Greeks are always mentioned in relation to the defeat of the Italians that we're commemorating today in the Greco-Italian War of 1940, but also the famous Battle of Crete. Let us briefly unpack these events. In the summer of 1940, the Italians, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, had besieged Malta, conquered Somaliland, and by the early fall, they were making inroads into Egypt. All of these places were under British rule, we have to remember. In late October 1940, the Italian army was ready to invade Greece from Albania. This is a context that we don't often think about, that there is a multitude of conflicts happening at the same time. When the Italian ultimatum arrives in Athens, Ioannis Metaxas, who was ruling the country through a personalistic dictatorship since 1936, had tried to keep Greece neutral up to that point. Having said that, Metaxas had been preparing the country for war ever since he came to power. He wasn't waiting for that moment in idleness. In any event, when the Italian ambassador communicated the perfunctory, really, Italian ultimatum in the early hours of October 28th, Metaxas, without consulting anyone else, replied in French, "It is war then." The press and the public used a single word to summarize his response: "Όχι." The Italian attack was repulsed within days with heavy Italian casualties, disproportionate, we should mention. By mid-January 1941, Greek forces occupied a quarter of Albania. Of course, Germany wanted to prevent the British from securing their position in the Eastern Mediterranean and were prepared to assist Italy. In a dramatic open letter to Hitler, published just a month before the German attack, the right-wing editor of Kathimerini, Georgios Vlachos, concludes with the following message, and that's also in the spirit of Churchill's message that I gave you earlier. The land which once taught the entire world how to live must now also teach it how to die. Germany invaded Greece a few months later, in April, a month later from this letter, in April 1941, and by May 20th, most of Greece was conquered, except from Crete. The Germans had a harder time than they expected in their operation to capture Crete, and the Battle of Crete is generally known, as it's generally known, was over following 2 weeks of intense fighting on June 1st. Greece was occupied and divided between Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. Mainland Greece was liberated in October 1944, but a fratricidal civil war had already begun a year earlier, and it would not end until the late 1940s. According to estimates, Greece suffered more than 400,000 casualties during the occupation, and the country's Jewish population was almost completely exterminated in the Holocaust. Now, let's return to the moment we're commemorating today. Some may view Metaxas's OXI as a spontaneous, instinctive almost response, but it wasn't. On October 30th, 1940, 2 days after the Italian ultimatum, Metaxas assembled all the newspaper editors of Athens. Seeking to ensure their genuine support for the war effort, there he revealed his own rationale that led him to his famous OXI, and thus explained how premeditated it was. He explained to them that while he sought to preserve Greek neutrality and keep the country out of the war, it was made abundantly clear to him by the Germans that Greece would have to be amputated to the benefit of Bulgaria and Italy for that to be achieved. He then went on to explain that such a development would inevitably divide the Greeks and lead to a repetition of the national schism that happened during World War I. You know that Greece was split in half, basically. And this would be, in his view, an unrepairable wound for the Greek nation if that were to happen. Moreover, as Metaxas went on to argue, Greece's natural ally from a geopolitical point of view was Britain, since it commanded the seas. And you can realize how difficult that was for Metaxas to accept, given his prior history, right? Both in the national schism and his relationship with King Constantine, who was married to a German origin royalty. So, moreover, as Metaxas went on to argue, of course, he was not naive. He made it clear to the newspaper editors that the struggle would be long, that Greece might even be enslaved, as he said, for a certain time period. But he also made it clear to them that he was confident that the Anglo-Saxon world would eventually prevail this fight. And he was correct. In that speech, he even correctly predicted what the territorial gain for Greece would be. The Dodecanese Islands that were under Italian rule. No disturbance at all. Metaxas died at the height of his glory as a respected leader on January 29th, 1941. Now imagine that date, January 29th, 1941. That's following the defeat of the Italians, and still the Greek forces are occupying 1/4 of Albania, but before the German attack of April 1941. So there couldn't have been a time that he was more revered as a leader, because he had successfully led the Greeks, who were, by the way, united, one of the few times that they were completely united in a cause. And as we know later on, they were not as united during the occupation. So let us return to the moment we're commemorating today for a final time. On October 28th, 1940, radios and telegrams repeated the following message all over Greece. Italian forces have launched attacks to our fortresses on the Greek-Albanian border since 5:30 a.m. Our armed forces are defending the fatherland. A few days later, the 5th Infantry Division, consisting of 566 officers and 18,662 soldiers from all over Crete, was sent to the Albanian border to fight against the Italians. One of them was my grandfather. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing I didn't know, I didn't understand. You said that Germans had informed Metaxas or whoever that Greece would have to be partitioned between Italy and Bulgaria. Does this mean that the Axis had decided to give half of Greece to Italy and half of Greece to Bulgaria?
No.
I know the Germans allowed the Bulgarians to occupy places like Drama and Kavala and all these places. But how did this mean? What do you mean by
Excellent question. I'm happy, as a professor, I'm happy when people don't understand something, because then I have a reason to elaborate. Metaxas was not a stranger to Hitler. He had been in contact with Hitler actually before the invasion by the Italians, while he was trying to negotiate Greece's neutrality, basically, right? Negotiate is a strong term. To see whether that was possible, let's say. It was made, as I said, abundantly clear to him that Greece, some part of Greece, could have achieved that goal, and that's what I was alluding to in my speech. So a part of Greece could have remained neutral and independent, but a chunk of it would have to be, not all of it. So it wasn't, the idea wasn't that it would be half and half kind of thing, because then there wouldn't be any Greece. But what he articulates very elaborately, it's a long speech he gave to the editors. I didn't want to bore you with all of it, but I can send you a link if you're interested, in Greek at least. I don't know, it must have been translated to English. I haven't found it. I did my own translation here. Oh yeah, okay, so I can send you the Greek passage. So the idea was that he realized that basically more or less what was Greece up to the mid-19th century could have remained independent, but significant parts of northern Greece, what we call Nees Chores, new lands, that were basically annexed to Greece in 1912 onwards, from the Balkan Wars onwards to the World War I and so on and so forth, would be probably under Bulgarian rule, so that would be contemporary Macedonia and Western Thrace, right? And then other parts, including some islands that, of course, the Italians coveted for their own reasons, in the Ionian Sea and so on and so forth, would be given to Italy, and including some parts where Italy actually was claiming, as early as World War I, was claiming that a lot of the Vlach-speaking populations in Greece, in the Epirus especially, were of Italian origin somehow, right? And there were actually even, I found in the Greek archives, the diplomatic archives in Greece, whole folders with Italian propaganda from World War I trying to instigate movements against the Greek sovereignty of the time by Vlach-speaking, in their minds, Italian-speaking or early Italian-speaking population. So it was a much longer... these type of claims have been in the making for a long time. They were not just coming to the forefront at that moment. And Metaxas was an old hand in Greek politics. I mean, he's not a newbie in all this, right, to speak in colloquial English. He was the general, many forget, he was the general that Venizelos himself, who was the biggest rival of his at the same time, he was one of his biggest admirers. So Venizelos wanted Metaxas to be his, I almost shiver while I'm thinking about this, and the counterfactual, to be his general who would go in Asia Minor instead of the other generals. And Metaxas denied that because he thought that was not a sound operation. So depending on how you see things and how you view the political turbulent times of the time, maybe Metaxas was right that this wasn't a viable operation. But the first choice, and I don't know how many of us realized this or knew that, Venizelos' first choice to lead that campaign was Metaxas. Despite the fact, and that's something that honors Venizelos now, despite the fact that Venizelos knew that Metaxas was not on his side. So those are both really big personalities, right? One in more military personality and the other political one. Of course, Metaxas ended up becoming a political personality by becoming a dictator, right? But it's something that gives you an appreciation of the time.
And I want to go back to the same question because for me it was new to here.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize the fact that this has not been properly communicated and understood by all of us, or many of us. Now, what I mean by that, I always had personally the question, I mean, was it really a sound decision of Metaxas to say no, because he knew that would be a lot of blood and a lot of, I mean, when we knew probably that Belgium and France surrender with nothing, essentially, Belgium mostly. And this to me, it is very important and should be better communicated as a result of even this event to all of us to know more.
Petrus will make sure that this is communicated. So.
Well, actually, we will.
I'm joking. Yeah. No, but beyond the my comment that was trying to lighten up things because they can get heavy because we're talking about a lot of lost lives. And I didn't continue with my grandfather, but my grandfather couldn't go back to Crete. His brothers fought in the Battle of Crete, and I remember my uncle, his brother, one of his many brothers who fought, one of them was remained in bed all his life because of wounds he incurred during the Battle of Crete, and he couldn't walk all his life, and he died in the early 90s in old age, but basically debilitated since then. So tragic stories that have to do with how his family and all sorts of other stories about the occupation itself. So I'm not trying to, not to mention the Civil War, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the hardship. And Metaxas himself had anticipated that in his own speech only 2 days later, right? Which implies that it wasn't something that he could retroactively kind of come up with. Now, the brilliance, I think, of this line of reasoning had to do with is only brilliant if you see it from the perspective of national interest, right? And that's kind of why I started with the quote of a daily plebiscite. That's a quote from Ernest Renan. He gave a lecture in 1882 at the Sorbonne, where right after a terrible defeat that the French had experienced, and the whole point was for him that the nation is a daily plebiscite. The existence of a nation is a daily plebiscite. And what he meant by that is that as long as people don't see themselves as purely individuals, right, just isolated individuals who are maximizing whatever they want to maximize, and as soon as they see themselves as a collective, be it a nation or some other collective, then the calculation of what is good, what is in an ancient way of defining it, καλό και αγαθό, let's say, changes, right? So from a perspective of individual prosperity maybe, or from what we would talk about as a utilitarian principle of maximization, right? Let's maximize the utility of individuals rather than of a collective, then maybe you're right, your insinuation is correct that probably maybe in an alternative universe or a parallel run of history, it's possible that utility maximization of individuals may have been different, right? But when it comes from a national interest perspective, which is very clear that Metaxas had that in mind, he was thinking of the nation as a unit, and the unit, he was calculating the utility of that unit. And from that perspective, if you start seeing utilitarianism again from that point of view, using as the unit of analysis the nation rather than the individual, the individuals as consist of it, this nation, then he was thinking that this schism that he experienced himself, right, in his life, prior to World War II and World War I, in this occasion it would be even deeper, because it would be a Greek government, right, that would have taken a decision knowing that this would lead to an amputation of the nation, right? And that would then lead to irreparable split in the psyche of all these nationalists in his mind, or Greek nationals, let's say, right? And they would have felt betrayed in a way that then it wouldn't be possible for someone who supported Metaxas in his, controversial neutrality, and those who didn't would never see themselves as part of the same group again.
I take the strong view, and certainly historians will back me up, others will not, that regardless of what the decision of Metaxassus was, what his motivation was, it put Greece right in the middle of the limelight, put it into a heroic stance, projected it, the first victory of World War II, you know, gave courage to others to stand up and fight. And at the end of the day, there are those who say it did ultimately change, okay, the course of the war by Hitler's delayed Operation Barbarossa of the Soviet Union. To that effect, Carl E. Meyer, an editorial writer in the New York Times, said on April 16, 1984, saying that Hitler believed that the several weeks took Germany to subdue Greece was responsible for his losing the war against the Soviet Union. So again, here from a respected journalist, your view.
So
did it change the course?
You're talking about yeah. So there is no doubt. First of all, we know for a fact that the Battle of Crete had a significant impact on Hitler's understanding of the use of paratroopers.
Never use them again.
Yeah. Although, ironically, it gave a different message to the Allies. So it's an interesting juncture there where Hitler experiences this colossal defeat for those days, because it is really a defeat. The ratio, if you look at the ratios of how many people he lost to conquer Crete, we could definitely see his victory as a Pyrrhic victory. There is no doubt. And that led him to, first of all, calibrate and rethink the use of parachuting or the practice of parachuting paratroopers in order behind enemy lines, let's say, as a practice. And that definitely had an impact on him. The other suggestion that often is made is that also that diversion of attention and resources had an impact of how the Soviet invasion unfolded. There's a controversy there that I don't want to get into, because there are some people that say that they have found evidence that June 22nd had already been chosen before the success. Others believe that the delay in Crete delayed that even further. Some people go into the weather conditions and whether that was a late spring or an early spring or whatever. I don't think that's as important from the perspective being half from Crete myself. I don't think people in Crete care about that necessarily. They care about the fact that they were, more importantly, the first civilian population. Again, I don't know if we realize it. The first civilian population that took up arms against the Germans. So that's a very important thing to realize. I mean, a lot of countries talk about their partisans and so on and so forth. This was a population that got up and took machetes or like whatever they were using in their fields and went against the people who were coming in full uniform with weapons to defend their land. So that's actually, from my perspective at least, that's much more important than fighting with some historians on whether the date was pushed by 2 weeks or not. Having said that, also I don't want to take away from the valiant struggle of many people from the Soviet Union in their fight against the Germans. That there is no doubt that the Russians incurred a humongous amount of human hardship and fatalities to fight the Nazis. So having a grandmother who was half Russian, I also need to, and half Greek, I also need to commemorate that.
20 million.
Yeah, so it's, you know, I think it's an important event no matter what. There is no doubt the first part of what you said, there is no doubt that the hope and the message, I think the symbolism is undoubtedly something that was really important and probably even made some people feel ashamed, I have to say, at the same time that it gave courage to some who were still not faced with the Nazi war machine. It probably put some people to shame that didn't do that, right? Both events. So in a way, it was a very important event, and I think for the Allies, the reason they commemorated, especially the Battle of Crete, but also, of course, the OXI Day, it was tremendously important for Britain, of course, who at the time, as you mentioned, was not surrounded by so many allies. I mean, France fell quite quickly, and the United States only formally gets into the war in early 1942. Well, or you can say late 1941, depending on how you want to view it, but formally. So those events are all happening much earlier than others are coming into the fight. So it's really tremendously important, I agree.
Rightly, the first victory of World War II belongs to the Greeks. And they decisively defeated the Italian army, which was significantly larger. And the Greeks advanced into Albania, and substantially advanced into Albania. My question, and I never have been able to figure out why, at which point did they stop, at which point did they return, and then having to take on the Wehrmacht.
Exactly. So it's a. I mean, we have military officials here that may tell you more of the, particular details of operations that took place. But
Do you remember that?
I'm sure he does. I'm sure he. And I would love you to tell us some of the more technical side of it. But I know from my grandfather that at some point it was announced to him he has to go back to the mainland just because another front had lost, right? So it's not that the Greek army, to my understanding, and it's from hearsay, unfortunately, but it's not that the people from Crete who were in Albania or in the other divisions ever lost in Albania, right? It's that the borders from Yugoslavia had already been defeated. Let's say the Greek army was defeated on the Operation Marita, I think it was called. And then it was announced to them that they have to withdraw as a result of that defeat, right? And that's what we could say vis-a-vis the Greek army that was in Albania. But for more technical details, maybe Colin.
Yes, it was a second front, and the Hellenic army was not able to support both two fronts. And we defend our territory also in Macedonia, but it was not possible to defeat also the German army because they chose to attack to Greece with a different directions. Yes, so.
So, how my grandfather would always tell me is like, we felt victorious, but at some point we were told we lost the war. Just to get you can imagine how this same army that had felt all these glorious few months basically there, and of course they didn't, experientially, I don't think they felt gloriously because they had lost a lot of their men, right? A lot of their comrades in arms had died as well. But at the same time, they were proud that they had defended the homeland and so on and so forth, right? But so it was a very conflicted moment for them that they had to, and that was not a very organized retreat, to be honest. And that meant that my grandfather experienced the experience of coming back from the Albanian front where he was a really unorganized and really difficult way back because they didn't have any procurements. Nobody was taking care, because as long as that was a regular line, food would come or ammunition and so on and so forth. But as soon as that stops happening, you have to walk back from wherever you are in the middle of Albania back to your homeland. And back to Crete. How do you find your way back to Crete And he never made it back to Crete until the end of the war. My grandfather, he had to stay in Macedonia. Yeah.
I've always been curious, when Metaxa refused to surrender, had he already had, and he was a general obviously, did he already have a sense of the Italians' military capacity versus the Greeks, and that at least the Greeks had a fighting chance to do what they did?
Thank you for the question. I will reverse the question. I think he had a great sense of his own army, and that gave him the confidence that you see emanating from his "it is war" then. So it's not just that he thought that the Italians were not as good in fighting, because as I just said, and I gave you that short passage of like the things that were going on at the same time in Malta, in Somaliland, in Egypt, the Italians were taking on the British army and their surrogate kind of colonial forces in various places. So it's not that the Italians were we have this stereotype about that army because of the result, but I think that kind of downplays the importance of how prepared our army was. Again, I don't want to make this into a comparison of that sort, but as I mentioned, he has been preparing for war since day one of taking up leadership through his dictatorship, right? So that's really, really showing on the field.
AHI. The neutrality, it's something we don't really talk about a lot, is we know Turkey was able to remain neutral during World War II. Do you see a scenario in which if there wasn't an invasion, Greece could have put themselves in the center and kept out of the conflict?
So it's good that you mentioned this, because we kind of left Turkey out of this altogether, although it wasn't really involved in the Metaxas decision, Turkey as a factor at that moment. But it's great that you're giving me the opportunity to say that, first of all, I don't think Turkey's neutrality is something that is celebrated, right? I mean, there is no doubt that the Allies could have used a Turkey that was on their side, right? So from that perspective, I think I'm glad we didn't remain neutral, right? So from that perspective, at the same time, also neutrality also meant inside Turkey some terrible policies that basically broke completely the back of the Armenian and the Greek communities in Turkey. So the Velik Vergisi, that really inhumane tax that was imposed on Turkish minorities at the time, led to the transfer of a lot of these people who could not pay that tax during World War II in labor camps that basically completely destroyed a lot of the middle class, Armenian and Greek and Jewish middle class. And that's a really, really terrible picture of modern Turkish history that very few people maybe know about and talk about. But that was, I know a lot about it because I study nation building and minority policies. But we should mention that. So it's not that neutrality also meant that everything was rosy within the Turkish Republic. So, especially for minorities, in a way, Turkey almost used it, and we should be ready to recognize that, use this to make Turkey even more Turkish, let's say, right? To nation built in a very violent, I would say, and discriminatory manner. So that's the domestic part of this. You're asking the international relations type of question. I think Metaxas answered your question in his speech by saying that he viewed that as impossible. In what sense? Turkey was never told that it would have to be amputated in order to remain neutral, right? Greece was clearly told that some really important and central allies of the Axis powers, basically Germany, wanted a piece of Greece, right? And both Bulgaria and Italy were allies of the Germans. While the Bulgarians were not claiming anything from Turkey, if geographically things were different or geopolitically, maybe Turkey would have had, or Turkish leadership would have had to make similar choice. But we were presented with a very different choice set than Turkey did at the time. But you give me the opportunity to mention some of the not so nice things that happened, terrible things that happened during this neutrality period.
To that effect, we spared no expense on promoting that aspect specifically of World War II. And here there's a number of books, including this very specific one, Greece's Pivotal Role in World War II and the Importance of the United States Today. Now, this was a conference, and these are the conference proceedings of a number of years ago. But this book here is an opus called The First Victory, Greece in the Second World War, which was published by our foundation and was authored by one of our members, an engineer by trade, but he did a meticulous job of bringing together the facts regarding Greece's role in World War II and why it was the first victory. And we're going to give these to you, Professor.
Thank you.
And for
Wow.
and for everyone else, they're available downstairs for purchase. On Turkey for a second. I wasn't going to bring it up, but since it was brought up. Well, Turkey, frankly, was never really a true neutral in World War II. If you were to read Albert Speer's book, Inside the Third Reich, he categorically states, and who was Albert Speer? Of course, he was Hitler's architect and armaments minister. And he categorically states that if it wasn't for Turkey and its providing raw chromium regarding the armament industry of Turkey, it would have been very difficult to continue to move in terms of those resources. And he states, actually, that because of Turkey's involvement in this capacity, it extended the war by 6 months. Well, I submit to you, every death on the battlefield and every death on a concentration camp, you can put it right in the doorstep of Turkey. And Turkey did declare war on Nazi Germany on the closing days. I think it was the last 5 or 6 days of World War II. So that's the history of Turkey in a nutshell. I'm sure Alice can give it to you in a much more greater detail. So it provided the opportunity to at least to tell about the great role of Turkey in World War II. Look, I'm no historian, but history is fluid, I would venture to say. And it's not out of context, and it's not within a vacuum. Something here leads to something here. Obviously, Versailles, you can argue, led to Hitler's rise, World War II, and the deaths of World War II. But sometimes, in a moment in time, you've got to stand up and make a decision based on just that moment in time. And that's what Metaxas did. Regardless what other motivation factors there were at play, what political dimensions, and what his other thoughts may have been, he had to make a decision. He was called on to make a decision. If somebody comes to my house, I may have an arsenal of weapons in my home. I have no intention maybe of using them. And I stockpiled them for the last 6 years. But then I have somebody break into my house. That moment I have to make a decision. What I'm going to do. Am I going to shoot this guy or her? Or I'm going to use some other element of approach to make this, resolve this problem. It's maybe a very simple analogy, but I think it plays out also on a stage of this magnitude regarding the invasion that Italy wanted to come in and have Greece capitulate. And it gave Greece, as I said earlier, the opportunity to be a small country and to rise to the occasion when others did not. Not because maybe they weren't able to. And maybe you can talk about Greece's geography, surrounded by water, and the Italians had to come through a very narrow passage, okay, through some very difficult terrain to come there. And that all happened. That also happened, of course, with the 300 Spartans too. The geography helped them there actually as well. It's not the current geography where you see this mass plain there. It was a much more narrow passage back in 400, whatever it was. But some numbers which are indisputable and are facts. Poland fell in 36 days. The Netherlands fell in 4 days. Belgium 18, France 43 in its famous Maginot Line. Yugoslavia 11, and good old Greece 178 days. No matter what the geography, no matter what the circumstances, they did not give up inch by inch until absolutely they had no recourse. That, in my opinion, needs to be celebrated. And that is what we're trying to do here today. We're not commemorating only, as Jim said, we are celebrating. And it needs to be, in my opinion, celebrated just a little bit more. Because when I am going through school in the United States and I'm doing history courses of World War II and Western Civ and all of this, and there's not even a byline. Not even a byline of what Greece did, okay, in World War II. And there's one other thing. And you understand it's a pet peeve of mine, right? 2005, I wanted to go to Normandy. Because I think every Western democratic person needs to visit Normandy. So many lives were lost for our freedom here today. It's a place we need to go and pay respect, in my humble opinion. So I took my daughter. She was kicking and screaming. I guess back then she was about 16 years old, 17 years old. We went to Paris, and I said, one of our days we're going to spend in Normandy. And it cost us like 240 euros a piece on some tour package to get there, believe it or not. And then we have this little tour this little history on the bus of this tour guide giving us various vignettes of World War II. And, I'm kind of falling asleep. It's early in the morning. All of a sudden I hear her say, and the first victory of World War II was Al Alamein. And then I woke up. And so at the very first stop, I went up to her and I said, hey, by the way, I said, you ever heard of this thing called OXI Day, where Greece celebrates October 28, 1940, defeating the Italians, which is pretty much recognized as being the first victory of World War II? And she goes, yes, you're right. Now, there was a lot of tourists on that bus from all parts of the world. She didn't come back and rectify that. I came here and I wrote a letter to the then ambassador of France to the United States, pointing out what took place, again, acknowledging that it's not up to the U.S. and the ambassador of France to the United States to oversee the tourist industry in Paris, but nonetheless, I wanted to put it on the record, and maybe he can pass the message along that history should be recognized for what it is and who does what. As I mentioned to him, everyone recognizes what the French resistance did, and they did an enormous amount, obviously. But history should also be recognized in terms of what others done as well. And de Gaulle did, by the way. I don't remember the exact quote, but I know de Gaulle did. I never received even a reply to that letter. And I was shocked. So when we're looking to have another Dunkirk movie made, okay, so I think there's been at least 2 or 3, okay, which was a disaster for the British at the end of the day. And we're lucky that the Germans then ultimately, continued to attack them, which would have destroyed their entire military. And how many hundreds and hundreds of movies do we see regarding World War II? And not once, if you want to put Guns of Navarone, a fictional story, which is a good story, but it wasn't a real story in terms of what Greece did on October 28, 1940, and for 178 long days. And in its continuation of its resistance, the resistance was fierce. The repercussions were tragic, but they continued in those resistance. And there's one little other sidebar. I don't know how many of you are aware that when D-Day, the aforementioned D-Day took place, there were 28 divisions in the Balkans of German divisions, 28 that were tied down by the Yugoslav partisans and the Greek resistance, and they needed to be there because of that's how prolific the resistance was. Well, there are those again who say if maybe even half of those divisions were deployed to Normandy, it may have been again a different situation. I'll just finish my comments by reading this quote, since we've been reading quotes today, appropriately so. And I'll tell you who said it at the end of the quote. As the years pass, it becomes more and more necessary to recall and record for new generations just how the people of Greece, alone or with allies, gained and held for their country for a century and more the independence and democracy it possesses today. And how in one special moment in history of Greece, at heavy cost and sacrifice, and with great courage and determination, played a pivotal role in World War II in defying the forces of tyranny and Axis aggression that were arrayed against not only Greece, but the whole Western civilization. It is an inspiring story. Former Supreme Commander of NATO, General Andrew Goodpaster. So, we will conclude our presentation of OXI Day on that, and remind you on more contemporary issues and what our friends the Turks are doing in the Eastern Mediterranean to create instability. You have on your seats this invitation to come and join us this Thursday at a panel discussion on the Eastern Mediterranean and the instability that's going on there at the Capitol Hilton from 10:30 to 12:30. So we welcome you to join us there. We thank you for coming out here today to help us commemorate and to celebrate OXI Day.